I want someone to take a shotgun to my mouth and pull the trigger. Because what do you mean Norman Osborn? The guy who hired an assassin to murder Peter and MJ's baby, who buried his Aunt May alive for months, who murdered Gwen Stacy, and sold his own son's soul to the devil. Well, what do you mean he's Spider-Man now? To put how ridiculous this is in perspective, I had a conversation with someone one day at a comic shop about how irredeemable Norman Osborn is, to which they mentioned that the same case could be applied to someone like Vegeta. That when Vegeta showed up, he pieced everyone Goku loved, and has now become one of Goku's greatest allies. So what makes Vegeta more acceptable than Norman in this case? Well, one had over 9,000 chapters that had Vegeta slowly and naturally steered in the redemption direction, which made it believable. And the other was just shot by a magical redeeming shotgun. You see what I'm getting at, right? I can't buy into this in any way, shape, or form, and as a matter of fact, I detest this on multiple levels that I can only attempt to put into words. See, my goal for this video that I've tussled with for weeks is to essentially educate you on every despicable deed the Green Goblin has ever committed onto Peter, along with his loved ones, or anyone else in general, and acknowledge several points why people could believe Norman can be redeemed, if you're that person, and then convince you why it's wrong on every single level. Because sometimes people are inherently vile, and there is just nothing that can be done about it. Firstly, I want to make it clear from the jump that Norman has never been a good man since birth. In current comics, Norman didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, what I did in all my years as the Goblin was awful, I should change my ways and be a good guy. Instead, Norman Osborn was artificially transformed into a good guy overnight. This was a change forced upon him that never felt right since it's happened, because now Norman's operating as Peter's guy in the chair, or the father figure Peter never had. Peter's out here saying he's one of the good guys now and patting him on the back for being Spider-Man. It's ridiculous, and I don't think it will ever work given the history you, the reader, have witnessed alongside Peter. That the people at Marvel don't even bother to keep consistent anymore. Like, I can't fathom how Peter can be in a room with Norman and just be cool with the dude that's ruined his life 10 times over for the love of the game.
Oh, but that was before. This is now. Forget about all that stuff. It was always this way. Everyone can be forgiven.
And I say no. There's no undoing that. One of my favorite Goblin stories that perfectly displays the point I'm making is where Peter kind of spectates Norman's childhood because comics are the way they are. And it's here that Peter witnesses firsthand what it was like for his greatest enemy growing up. Norman's father, Amberson Osborn, often coming home in a drunken fury, beating on his own family, only to awake the next day to apologize endlessly, just to do something worse the next day. Now, due to the chaotic nature of Norman's childhood, Norman vowed to never let himself become like his father, to earn a fortune off his own genius, and to destroy any and all weakness within him by first killing his own dog, Mucky, saying to himself after committing the act that only the strongest will survive. Peter, witnessing this, at first feels bad for Norman and can understand how he became the monster he knows as the Green Goblin. But even so, knowing it doesn't make it any better. It doesn't excuse what the Goblin has done. Peter has had his fair share of difficulties and still never directly brought out harm to others for personal gain. Norman killed a fucking dog. That's like the most famous way to establish that someone is fundamentally evil. This was just in Norman's nature from the jump, always determined to grasp at power with his own two hands, creating Oscorp, marrying his college sweetheart Emily Lehman Osborn, and having their son Harry, projecting this image of a perfect and strong family when that couldn't be further from the truth, because several years after Harry would be born, Emily would fall ill and later die. Supposedly, this is comics, nobody ever fucking dies anymore. To which Norman would react to this by burying himself in his work, leaving Harry alone and scoffing at the idea of quality time with his only son, despising Harry's need for love from him, considering his mother just fucking died. I don't think Norman ever really loved Harry, to tell you the God's honest truth. I think Norman certainly loved to LARP as a father and bestow endless gifts upon Harry, but this was done simply to attain some hollow public image that he was this grade A father figure to Harry, when in reality he could give less of a shit if his own son was alive or dead. In fact, well before becoming the Green Goblin, I'm talking years before, Oscorp would be on the verge of complete bankruptcy. Mephisto, knowing who Norman Osborn would later become, approaches Norman with a proposition to save his company and give Norman the power he seeked all his life, but at a cost: the soul of his son and a sacrifice of Mephisto's choosing. At first, Norman declines, but the offer becomes all-consuming in his mind. I mean, look at it from his perspective. Norman has nothing to lose here. He doesn't care about his son, and what's a stranger's life compared to a life of unlimited power? Norman convinces himself, in a way only a complete lunatic could, to go through with the deal, damning his own son to hell and the sacrifice bit to come much, much later. As the years went by and Norman's relationship with Harry soured even further, Harry hating his own father would tamper with chemicals, leading to the Goblin formula exploding in Norman's face, changing Norman Osborn into the monster we all know as the Green Goblin. Now this is where I'd end this section by saying something like, oh, Norman was always evil, and then move on to the next bit. But bear with me here. Just before Norman would make it his mission to control Intergang and make Spider-Man's life a living hell, Norman still has a choice at this point in time, until he be commanded by Mephisto to carry out the last part of the bargain, commanded to kill a man named Alan Ardman, a man with a loving wife and pair of kids, without an ounce of evil within him, something deeply precious to Mephisto. At first, Norman sets out as the Green Goblin without a second thought, but it's when Norman is just one pumpkin bomb away from everything he's ever dreamed of having. Norman hesitates. Norman can still back out of the deal. Norman sees himself, Emily, and Harry happy together, but Norman senses the hesitation and swiftly snuffs it out, soon tying Alan up and flying him away to terrorize Alan before killing him, successfully securing his destiny at the expense of everyone else but himself. Surely Norman Osborn can be absolved of all of his crimes because he's insane, right? Okay, well firstly we have to address that Norman did not go insane when stricken with the Goblin Serum. Norman, as it turns out, was well within his faculties when receiving his newfound strength, and upon possessing it, Norman was immediately infatuated with the idea of controlling all crime in New York, developing the suit, the pumpkin bombs, the glider, and all the various gadgets and bases scattered across the city, dubbing himself the Green Goblin. Green because that's his favorite color, and a goblin for his insatiable greed. Norman is still a normal man who just puts on the goblin suit and pretends to be insane to throw people off. So no one could ever think that Norman and the Green Goblin are the same man. At first he's pretty silly and tosses around with Spidey occasionally, but over time as they both got better and better, naturally the stakes would grow larger as a result. The Green Goblin, tired of Spider-Man standing in the way of his criminal endeavors, would orchestrate certain events to unfold that'd bring him to discover that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Jumping Peter with his pants down, the Goblin would achieve victory over Spider-Man and hold him captive to torture him to death. Totally forgivable. So when Peter's tied up, he's left with nothing but his wits. So he rage baits Norman enough that Norman's ego would inspire him to incite a rematch. One of the key things I've found is that Norman has a very fragile ego, and whatever blow towards him, big or small, Norman won't take it lightly. It's perhaps his greatest weakness, and Peter uses this against him many, many times in the future. Norman is beaten by Peter after essentially bashing in his head, and when regaining consciousness, he completely forgets he's the Green Goblin. And for a time, Norman turns out to actually be somewhat good, until he sees a random locked door inside a club and has a That's So Norman moment, changing into the Green Goblin as if they were two distinctly different people. This led to Peter having to beat the Goblin up so good he'd wake up as Norman and think it was all a nightmare. But after this, Peter is stressed the fuck out like you wouldn't believe. He's hanging out with the gang, and whenever Norman makes a slight appearance, Peter's sweating, his heart is racing, and he's thinking to himself, does he know I'm Spider-Man? Is he gonna try and kill me and my friends right now? Does Norman remember he's the Green Goblin? Surely not, right? It's around the time Harry overdoses on LSD that Norman starts stressing out and memories start flooding back to Norman of being the Green Goblin, his feud with Spider-Man, and that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. To which Norman, wanting to get back at Peter for keeping his true nature hidden from him, would kidnap Gwen Stacy and throw her off the Brooklyn Bridge, leaving Spider-Man to kill his own lover. Oh! You're cooked. It's past this point that a good friend of mine named PSM, that's also on YouTube, pointed out that he liked the effect that Norman had as the Green Goblin when he was dead. And this was something I didn't think about until he mentioned it, because I never really thought about the way Norman Osborn haunts the narrative of Spider-Man's story from here on. One of the major effects Norman left behind after his death was Harry Osborn taking the mantle as the new Green Goblin. Harry discovers Peter is Spider-Man, and instantly comes to the conclusion that Peter killed his father, therefore wanting revenge, believing that he owes it to his father to keep the Green Goblin alive in his memory. This leads to the tragic downfall of their friendship, as Harry would dedicate his life to tormenting Peter. While Peter can do nothing but hope that Harry can believe that his own father was a vile human being that killed himself and Gwen. And yet it's after Peter subdues Harry that Harry is sent to receive the best mental rehabilitation money can buy and forgoes the Green Goblin identity for a bit, going on to marry Liz Allen and having a child named Normie Osborn after Norman. Another effect Norman Norman's death would leave behind were the numerous goblin hideouts scattered around New York, left lying around for anyone to stumble upon, in which Norman's death indirectly led to the birth of the Hobgoblin, another psychotic lunatic hell-bent on tormenting Spider-Man for some time. Something that, when brought to the attention of Harry, now leading a life as a family man, would pretty much undo all the progress he thought he had made, leading us to one of the greatest Spider-Man stories ever made, called Child Within. A heavy-hitting story about generational trauma and how hatred can tear a person apart from within. Harry begins to carry on his father's lunacy again, lashing out at Peter and anyone close to him, including his own son, because in Harry's mind, Norman is haunting him. Harry tortures Peter constantly, but there's a push and pull within himself. Harry often switches to the Goblin persona because being Harry has become too hard. The struggle Harry goes through is heartbreaking. He wants to do right by his father, but deep down knows that Norman was awful, and that the power he wields, while so very enticing, is catastrophic to everyone he loves. Liz is terrified of Harry and walks on eggshells around him because she never knows when he'll snap next. And Normie, over time from watching how crazy his father acts, starts to mimic his actions, confusing wrong with right. Harry can't deal with it and course correct. When it gets tough, he slips into the Goblin and all the fear just washes over. See, Harry never had a reliable support system. Harry lost his mother as a child and was left with an emotionally absent father that lashed out at him if the wind blew left instead of right. Harry never got to experience a sense of normalcy. In having a family of his own, he thinks the right thing to do is to be like his father, to be as cold and as secretive, to be as fierce and as unloving. But there are moments where Harry catches himself and knows what he's doing is wrong, and it's that spark of light within him, no matter how dim, that the old Harry pulls through in the end and saves everyone. But even so, it's at the cost of his own life. It's bittersweet, but at the very least Peter got to see the old Harry again, no matter how brief. And that was enough for the both of them in the end. And then Harry wakes up in hell as a last fuck you from his own father. See, Norman being dead had a way of haunting Peter as the years trudged on, and despite all of the darkness Norman left behind as the Green Goblin, Peter learned to move on, and having a child with MJ. At the time, no longer Spider-Man because Ben Reilly was filling in as Spider-Man since it was revealed Ben Reilly was the original and Peter the clone. Fucking comics, man. MJ would sadly end up miscarrying due to an assassin being hired to kill the baby in the middle of delivery though, and the person who hired one of the most evil hits a person could ever make was revealed at the end to be Norman Osborn. What? Okay, well this was during Clone Saga, so surely he's just a clone from here on out. I mean, that would make more sense. Like, could you imagine if Norman Osborn actually survived and was just existing after everything that's happened? Welcome to Stupid Town. Apparently after Norman's death, his healing factor kicked into overdrive and brought him back to life before he could be buried, after which Norman flew to Europe to orchestrate the events of Clone Saga for over 7 years in the shadows. It's a lot of contrived bullshit to explain how Norman could come back and somehow take credit for something he was never a part of, just to kill off Ben Reilly and confirm Peter was the original the whole time so they could return to the status quo, while effectively ruining what made Norman's death so compelling at the same time. It's the same thing with Craven, how at the end of Last Hunt he killed himself in the end after he felt that he won, leaving Peter totally traumatized by the end of the event and like with no closure. But once they start resurrecting these characters and throwing them against the wall to see what sticks, it really demerits their deaths and what they meant going forward for Peter. From then on, terrorizing Spider-Man in several different ways, like convincing Peter that his baby was still alive and could be saved, or kidnapping and torturing Peter anytime he went near light in his basement, or framed Spider-Man for murder after drowning a stranger with his web fluid. There was also that one time he 9/11 the Daily Bugle, and the time he made Flash Thompson drink copious amounts of alcohol and force him to crash his car into the school Peter had been teaching at, just to form a truce by the end. A truce that lasts barely a minute because Norman gets his skull caved in and his secret identity gets exposed. Peter's now unknowingly upped the ante of their game like never before. Therefore, Norman hires Matt Gargan to kidnap and bury Aunt May alive for months to send Spider-Man on a wild goose chase for his own personal amusement. There's an instance I really love where Peter is so desperate to find Aunt May that he goes to Norman for answers, and Norman does nothing but have fun watching Peter squirm, telling Peter that he convinced a security guard to basically serve floor cleaner to his wife in order to cure her cancer, saying if he did that to a guard he barely knows. What answer does Peter think he'll give to the man he hates the most? Later, Norman forms the Sinister 12 to kill Spider-Man, while Norman pays tribute to the anniversary of Gwen's death by attempting to kill Mary Jane the same way. way, if not for an unexpected variable getting in the way and stopping Norman, allowing Peter to save Aunt May at the very last second. It's after this battle, though, that Norman unexpectedly writes a letter to Peter about his admiration for him and giving Norman a life with meaning, and that he's looking forward to what their game will look like in the near future. Speaking of letters, Peter gets a letter from Gwen Stacy that's a fragmented plea for forgiveness, which is incredibly strange for Peter to receive given that Gwen has been dead for years. Yet upon reading, Peter finds that the letter happens to be missing crucial parts, to which Peter has the indentations on the back of the letter analyzed to find out that when she left for Europe, she became pregnant during that time and delivered 2 children. Reading this, it is unbelievable. Absolutely inconceivable to Peter. There's just no way this is real. And yet 2 people start targeting Peter, claiming that Peter's a murderer that deserves to die for killing their mother, validating the letter he received from Gwen. Now, as the story progresses and Peter discovers the truth, it had turned out that Norman and Gwen had gotten together. Gwen became pregnant as a result, she then had children, and not long afterwards, Gwen's death occurred. It was at this time when Norman fled to Europe that he'd raised the children to believe their mother was killed by Spider-Man, training them to become brutal and efficient soldiers that could torment Peter on a level Norman never had imagined possible. Peter, having this revelation, fucking destroys his entire apartment and wishes more than anything that Norman were right in front of him so he can kill him, but knows deep down that Gwen's children are just as much a victim of Norman as Peter is, and so Peter tries anything he can to get through to them, to tell them the truth, that they were lied to by Norman their whole lives, that Norman never loved them, and that they were only pawns in his game, never anything more. But even so, nothing stops it from ending in complete and total tragedy, just how Norman would have wanted it to be for Peter anyway. Now, before you rush to the comments and think I'm not going to address that this has changed now, don't worry. I am aware that Harry hired Mysterio to gaslight Peter into thinking that his own father slept with Gwen and had his children, which ended up being cyborg children that could still super age, which is perhaps even worse and more ridiculous and absurd than what originally happened. See, I like that in this story, Norman hurts Peter on such an unimaginable level. Peter's perception of the day Gwen died was all about him, and instead the story makes that day so much darker, when you consider Norman targets Gwen not just to get to Peter, but to kill the mother of his children to get them all to himself. It's a ridiculous story, and yet another thing on Norman's list of unforgivable deeds that will only continue to grow further. Take Civil War, for instance. During the Superhuman Registration Act, Tony Stark, now head of S.H.I.E.L.D., would uncharacteristically appoint Norman Osborn leader of the Thunderbolts, relying on pure faith that Norman had actually been rehabilitated. But this is unsurprisingly not the case at all. While highly medicated to suppress his goblin insanity, Norman is still a downright awful man. I don't think it'd be a surprise to find out that the only person Norman somewhat gets along with during this time is also Bullseye, letting him kill staff every once in a while to take the edge off or to share a few insane ideas with. They kinda hate each other at first, but it was a real treat witnessing their friendship blossom, especially when it came to their collective hatred for Spider-Man. While team leader, Norman is shown to be incredibly untrustworthy, basically giving each member of the Thunderbolts false promises so they all serve Norman without question. Hey Norman, are you gonna bring my sister back from the dead?
Oh, in like a fucking year, shut the fuck up!
And it's only when the Skrulls commence their secret invasion that Norman acts like a strong and loyal leader to bolster ratings with the American people, by literally killing the Queen of the Skrulls on live television. It's after the world is saved and has witnessed Norman's display of heroism, the US government tells Tony Stark to kick rocks, as they appoint Norman Osborn to be the new Secretary of Defense. And now a psychotic lunatic has basically been given free reign to do whatever he pleases to America. Norman's first act being the disbandment of S.H.I.E.L.D. and creating Hammer in its place. Norman creates a new team of Avengers comprised of several villains disguised as popular heroes. Almost murders Iron Man to claim the list of every registered superhero's secret identities, allows Bullseye to play with Daredevil a little by blowing up an apartment building full of families, sends Daken to slice the Punisher into 100 little itty-bitty slices like he's chopping it up at the deli, and secretly captures and experiments on mutants to form his own dark X-Men for good publicity. Norman sits on the throne of the world, and no one can stop him. Norman even sometimes laughs at how he used to waste all his time on Spider-Man, taking full advantage of his power by allowing villains to do whatever they want and remain free. Norman's ego has now soared to astronomical heights, but as I've said before, it's his ego that more often than not brings about his undoing, because Norman Osborn attempts to take over Asgard, an attack that led to the US government losing their faith in Norman completely, while all of Earth's mightiest heroes, tired of watching on the sidelines, finally set everything aside to stand united and show the world what real heroes look like. In the end, Norman's insanity is put on full display for everyone in the world to witness, sending Norman and any of his supporters straight to jail. At first, this is crushing to Norman, as he was at the absolute height of his power, just to have it all snatched away right out from under him. But with a bit more thought, Norman's true nature has been revealed to the world, and he no longer needs to keep his evil nature a secret. This turns out to be a blessing for Norman in disguise, since in prison, people rally to Norman, lunatics all crowding together to worship him. Norman witnesses this, and sees a new opportunity to create his own goblin empire as its leader.
It's also during this time that Norman takes notice that he's detracted himself from Spider-Man for quite a while, and that's something that Norman feels a need to correct. But imagine his surprise when he can't remember Spider-Man's secret identity anymore, or witnessing Spider-Man kill his own villains, or blackmailing JJ for his own Spider Island. This isn't the same Spider-Man he's fought against for years. Through Norman's deduction and carefully planned strikes against the superior Spider-Man, Norman discovers that the man inside the skin of his arch nemesis is Otto Octavius. Norman proposes a partnership to Otto, that New York be controlled by the Green Goblin while Otto can remain his second in command. This begins a battle of egos between the Green Goblin and Doc Ock, only for Otto to find that the Green Goblin is superior to Otto in every conceivable way.
I mean, he gave Otto's ex-fiancée AIDS before this. Otto was screwed before their fight ever began. He kills Otto's best friend, almost murders a child Otto saved in his first days as Spider-Man, and sends New York into complete chaos. The Goblin is unstoppable, so Otto uses the only play he has left to beat the Green Goblin. He gives Peter his life back, culminating in the final showdown between Green Goblin and the one and only Peter Parker. In the fight, Peter wipes the floor with Norman's face, and uses some of Otto's spider bots to completely cure Norman of his goblin power, rendering Norman Osborn a normal man once more. After which, Norman manages to slip away from Peter's clutches and takes back to the shadows to conjure up a new plan to take revenge against Spider-Man. Norman attempts to take more goblin serum, hoping to counteract the goblin cure to no avail. So in a desperate attempt to regain his goblin power, Norman takes to Tibet to learn sorcery in order to undo the effects and take revenge against Spider-Man. But the Tibetan monks see right through Norman and his lies of searching for inner peace and cast him out. Norman, absolutely mauling, thinks that if he can't beat Spider-Man with his strength anymore, surely he can beat Spider-Man with his mind alone. And yet again, Spider-Man defeats him. It's defeat after defeat that Norman, sick of losing, takes drastic measures and acquires the Carnage symbiote to bond with himself. Thus, the Carnage symbiote separates the Goblin Cure from Norman's body and increases Norman's strength tenfold. After which, Norman locks in on making Spider-Man's life a living hell by torturing JJ to reveal Spider-Man's secret identity. And upon relearning his identity, Norman bombs the Daily Bugle as the Red Goblin and terrorizes Peter on such a level he's terrified of Norman for the first time in his life. From here, Norman goes on a rampage, terrorizing each of Spider-Man's loved ones, murdering an old college buddy that ratted on him once for cheating in class, and hunts down his own family, but not before indoctrinating Normie into the family business. Yet it's through Peter borrowing the Venom symbiote that he does manage to get a leg up on Norman, but in response to this, Norman sadly murders Flash Thompson, and starts murdering numerous innocent people in Times Square. Norman is at a point where he can finally squash Peter like a bug, yet Peter calls out the fact that Norman needed a symbiote to kill him, and this drives Norman mad. Norman's ego has taken a nasty hit because what Peter says reigns true. Norman could have thrown the Carnage symbiote away after it did its job, but keeping it made everything all the easier. So Peter challenges Norman to a one-on-one with no symbiotes, and Norman takes the bait, furiously removing the Carnage symbiote, claiming he doesn't need anyone. At first, Norman puts up a hell of a fight, but Peter, like always, gets the upper hand and wins. Yet it's when Norman is defeated, he desperately reaches for the Carnage symbiote until Peter completely destroys it, sending Norman into a catatonic state, thereafter referring to himself only as Cletus Cassidy. Now, of course, while Norman cosplays as Cletus Cassidy, he does do a bit of murdering during the Absolute Carnage event and almost kills Normie, Peter, and Dylan Brock. But he does inevitably become himself once again, able to return to a life of wealth and privilege after stating that he was a victim of the Carnage symbiote and could not control his madness, which naturally led to Norman becoming a target of a villain by the name of Sin Eater, granted the ability by another villain named Kindred to cleanse criminals of their sins, with a shotgun no less. Spider-Man would set aside their never-ending feud to save Norman from the Sin Eater, but when saved, Norman would start sniffing Ghost Spider, recognizing her as Gwen Stacy, to which Norman would start making creepy remarks about how he'd forgotten how intoxicating she was, and that with time, they'll make a great pair, like
he had with the original Gwen. This leads Peter to fucking snap right then and there, and remember all the pain and misery he's let go on by saving Norman countless times over. When Norman goes free, someone always dies. So Peter makes a different choice this time and throws Norman to the wolves. Peter realizes that while he can't kill Norman, it doesn't mean he has to save him either, which happens to lead to one of my favorite moments from Norman Osborn. See, after being thrown out by Spider-Man, the Sin Eater catches up with Norman, and it's here that the Sin Eater doesn't really say much. Norman instead does all the talking. You see Norman in a way I don't think he's ever been put on display before. You see Norman terrified of dying, begging on his knees to be spared, trying any and all ways to slither out of the predicament, and then witness him realize that no one is coming to save him, to the point he accepts defeat and drops the act completely, showing just how conniving Norman Osborn truly is all the way up until the bitter end, as Norman is then shot dead by a magical redeeming shotgun, to awaken as Norman Osborn born again. I think in order to forgive a man like Norman Osborn, you have to fall from a tree and land really hard on your head. That way you suffer from complete amnesia to the point you can't recall who you even are, let alone who Norman Osborn is. Which must have happened to the writers at Marvel, because they've kept Norman Osborn a somewhat normal guy for roughly 5 years now. But for the life of me, I can't fathom why. It'd be like making the Joker the saner. The Green Goblin is the wild card for Spider-Man, the complete opposite of everything Peter believes in. His ultimate nemesis. Now maybe it's for build up until a new writer comes along with a worthwhile story that reintroduces the Green Goblin. Maybe they tested the material with 3-year-olds who can't read with resounding feedback. Who fucking knows? But Marvel is dead set on redeeming Norman. So I want to walk through the last few years and point out the major story beats that have led Norman to become redeemed. Because this video is not about the destination, it's about how I force myself to read slop instead of doing something more productive with my time. Like doing black tar heroin. At the start of Zeb Wells' run of Spider-Man, Norman is struggling under the weight of all of his sins, because while he's been cleansed, he still remembers everything awful he's ever done. So in attempts to atone for his evil past, Norman offers to provide Peter with limitless resources as Spider-Man, giving him a spider goblin suit, some spider bombs, and a glider of his very own, so long as Peter works at Oscorp. However, this isn't really easy for the both of them to just agree to, given their history. But Norman is making an effort, and despite how much hatred Peter harbors for Norman, Peter has to believe that Norman is capable of being a good man and takes the job. But it's also a way for Peter to keep an eye on Norman in case he ever goes green again. Now, skipping ahead a bit, Peter is almost killed if not for Norman taking it upon himself to become the Gold Goblin. I'll admit, I thought this was a very stupid thing to ever exist years ago, but for the sake of this video, I gave the Gold Goblin series a read. And to my surprise, it was actually pretty good. I think the reason why I didn't want to give it a shot was because when I initially saw it, I was comparing it to Amazing Spider-Man by Zeb Wells. Because I feel that in Zeb Wells' Spider-Man series, while he's writing all of these different characters like MJ, Paul, Norman, and Peter, he kind of doesn't have any way of giving these characters distinctive storylines or traits that make them remarkable in any way other than being mascots in Peter's life. But in the Gold Goblin series, it served as a way to actually get you in the mind of Norman and see through his perspective that while he's been cleansed of all of his sins, it doesn't necessarily mean that he can sleep at night. He struggles every waking moment to try to be better given the weight of all the evil he's done. So he can't think about any other way to live his life than by trying to be a hero, which I think is quite an endearing quality to the story, since an attempt is made to make Norman atoning for his sins somewhat believable. It pits the story in a way where Norman has never been allowed to feel the weight of everything he's done. So when confronted by it, Norman tries to run away from it until it finds a way to catch him. He starts seeing Gwen with her neck broken, flashes of his evil deeds, even his dog Mucky. Instead of getting a treat, he got his brains bashed in by a 7-year-old. I'd haunt Norman too. Norman tries anything to earn their forgiveness, and repeatedly goes out of his way to do the right thing on numerous occasions, until the embodiment of all Norman's sins comes at him in the form of the Queen Goblin, in efforts to be whole once again as the Green Goblin. This plotline threads through to the 50-issue mark of Amazing Spider-Man when she works with Kraven to unite the essence of the Goblin back with Norman, by putting the essence of the Goblin inside of a blade and stabbing Norman with it, which leads Peter to jump in the way of the blade and become the new host to the Green Goblin. And in my opinion, it's the highlight of the run. I swear, it's the only somewhat interesting part because you get to see Peter be a spiteful lunatic for a few issues. Only the whole atonement thing Norman had going on gets distilled into absolute nothingness, because then the Goblin comes out of Spider-Man and goes inside Norman. Then he goes inside Peter again. Then they go in each other, and it just occurred to me now that I didn't have to read this. Together, they finally destroy the Goblin
adolescence forever, and it's one of the most forced and cringe redemption arc endings ever made. Norman hopes for the day Peter can look upon him as a friend in the tone of, "What are we waiting for?" And Peter remains unopposed to the idea. It's written in my eyes at least to serve as a cheap way for Norman to earn forgiveness from Peter and create a new thing to point your fingers towards instead of the man who actually carried out the acts. Fuck off, man. In the last few years, while there's certainly been an attempt made to make a redeemed Norman Osborn convincing to a Spider-Man fan, it fails on numerous levels because anytime the idea is presented, it always feels cheap, inconsistent, and forced with never enough build-up or forethought. I feel like Marvel is trying to shove something in our faces they don't believe in themselves, but they have to play the part or else they'll get shot behind the camera or something. I don't think Norman can be redeemed, and I think he's Marvel's most vile villain, but you can be the judge if this monster can be redeemed or not, if it's not obvious enough. I'll catch y'all on the flip side.
They say never to go to a grocery shop while you're hungry.